Episode 3, AD 500 to 620. There is a fundamental and mistaken premise which structures all of our perceptions of European history. This is that there was a fall of the Roman Empire and an onset of barbarism.
Throughout the 5th century, wave after wave of invading tribes, Goths, Vandals, Franks, Britons, and Saxons, flooded in and fought to stake their claim on the waning empire.
That there followed an end of civilization and the beginning of an age of darkness.
The glory of Rome was gone forever, and the Dark Ages had begun.
This perception is wrong. We have been viewing it exclusively from the perspective of the west of Europe and have dismissed the Roman East, as if it were not even Roman. And we cement our distorted view by calling it instead Byzantium, a made-up and pernicious term, which is utterly alien to the reality it purports to describe. Throughout the 300s AD, Constantinople was already beginning to eclipse the imperial cities of the West as the center of political gravity of the Roman Mediterranean. Rome remained as a huge and opulent city, but it had long since ceased to be the political capital, which had moved first to Mediolanum, Milan, and then became partly nomadic. The western capital was where the Western Emperor temporarily resided, for example in Trier, in Sirmium, or in Arles. In 402, the capital of the Occident was permanently set at Ravenna, striking evidence of the magnetic political and cultural pull of the now clearly dominant center of the empire, Constantinople. For this reason alone, it is nonsense to speak of the fall of the Roman Empire at some point in the 400s AD. The region in which, politically, the imperium did collapse in the Occident was by then its periphery, not its heart and center. Further, even in the western provinces, where a set of sub-Roman regna, or kingdoms, took shape, there was no sudden collapse of civilization. What occurred was a change at the level of the military and political elite. Local Roman military commanders, the magistri militum, or a usurping petty emperor, was ousted by the effective commanders of their troops, the tribal war leaders and kings of the Germanic formations, who in fact constituted, by that time, the Roman army. In the course of this transformation in the West, there were many episodes of destruction, plunder, and massacre, as order temporarily broke down. But such calamities were not unknown when the empire had been functioning normally. Indeed, the enormously burdensome taxation system of the late Western Empire was dealt a serious blow as the Germanic kings and their warrior elites settled in. Some Roman taxation revenues continued to be collected, particularly from what had been the imperial fiscus, the imperial estates, now owned by the kings. But in many areas the new aristocracy, living on the income from their estates, yielded only payments of tolls and for justice to their kings. The Roman state, the state as such, as a unit of administration and taxation, funding a standing army, simply no longer existed. For these reasons, primarily the evaporation of the imperial and municipal taxation systems, the Roman cities of the West began to stagnate. They had always been largely centers of consumption, whose economic basis rested on the residence of the senators, the offices of the administration, the courts, and the establishment of the army, with all their ancillary services. it would be mistaken to think of an instant ruralization of society, apart from the unfortunate and remote case of Britannia. The Frankish and Gothic elites of Gaul and Hispania continued to live at least part of their lives in the Roman cities, which, as massive infrastructures and as the only fortified centres, continued to be the focus of life. The wealthy senators resided less permanently in the cities. The salaried Roman administrators and officials suffered unemployment, with only a few remaining. The army now consisted of the Germanic warrior caste and their tribal followers, who expected to be paid in coin or in kind from the confiscated estates. Accordingly, institutions of education, the schoolmasters around the forum, the civic libraries and the record offices, continue to operate, but in a diminished form. Reading the sources from these times, one comes across the repeated mention of Syrians and Jews as merchants. Long-distance trade continued throughout the 5th and 6th centuries and was largely in the hands of these specialists of Levantine origin, who formed distinct communities at Paris, Marseille, or Toledo. Their activities reflect one of the great economic facts of the Roman world at this period, that the economic heart of the Mediterranean lay in the east, in the Levant, in Syria and Egypt. It was there that the sea routes and caravan routes from further Asia reached the access points to the Mediterranean basin, bringing classic high-value commodities such as spices, perfumes, silks, precious metals, ivory, and slaves. It was in great Romano-Hellenic cities like Alexandria that papyrus was manufactured, so essential for a document-based civilization. Far into the 600s AD, the scribes of the Merovingian kings of northern France used this papyrus, imported through Marseille from Roman Sicily, to keep their records and write the royal correspondence. Looked at as a whole, as an organic, economic, and political, indeed as a civilizational nexus, the Romano-Hellenic world was turned toward and lived through the Mediterranean. Places like Britannia, northern France, eastern Hispania, the Danube frontier lands of Noricum and Pannonia, central Europe south of the river, were but hinterlands to the Mediterranean world, whose essential function was to act as a bulwark against the endless outside, the non-Mediterranean world. What was important were the Mediterranean heartlands. These were the coastal cities, or those like Rome set back from the coast. Rome is incomprehensible without Ostia, where the population was most dense, where the physical and social infrastructures of Romanitas were most highly developed, and by the 400s, where Christianity was most widely implanted. These heartlands, made up of a necklace of remarkably similar-looking cities, were in northern Egypt, focused on Alexandria. They were along the coast of the Levant, centered on Antioch. Syria, Judea, and Egypt were also the homelands and remained the heartlands of Christianity. These cities sparkled throughout the Aegean Islands, and particularly around the southern and western coast of Asia Minor, today's Turkey, as they did in Greece. Constantinople presided in majesty over this most ancient and integrated network of cities, and was soon to become the most opulent and greatest city of the Middle Ages. In the west, Italy remained the center. Rome was a huge conurbation within its massive Aurelian walls, built in 275 AD. But it too suffered from having its privileged status as the caput mundi, the head of the world, having been removed from it by Constantine. No longer being the seat of the imperial government, it was destined to wither. The position of chief citizen of the great city was now occupied by its bishop, the Papa, the Latin word used by children for their father, in English, the Pope. And let us not forget the province of Roman Africa, today's Tunisia and northern Algeria, with its annex of Sicily. In the Occident, Carthago, or Carthage, and its surrounding region lay at the second rank in its Romanness after Italy itself. And by the 400s AD, North Africa was also densely and intensely Christian. It was the homeland of Augustinus, St. Augustine, whose writings give us such a vivid picture of Roman life there. And it was the location of one of the earliest and most nasty doctrinal and ecclesiastical civil wars between the so-called Donatists and the Orthodox, represented by Augustinus. It was here that the law and coercion of the Roman state was first systematically deployed in 409 to suppress people condemned as heretics. In Spain, it was the cities of the east, coastal Tarraconensis and Carthaginensis, and the southern tip, Baetica, which were the most settled, had the most developed cities, and were the most deeply Roman and Christian. And finally, just as Rome had lived for centuries from the imperial grain ships from Carthage, providing the bread for the bulk of the poor of the city, so too did Alexandria bring the grain of the Nile to feed the crowds of poor citizens for whom the emperors continued to put on great chariot races in the hippodrome at Constantinople. This huge, well-organized system of social welfare, operated by the praefecti annone, with offices in Carthage and Alexandria and command over a fleet of cargo ships, ensured prosperity, political tranquility, and imperial splendor in these two great cities in their heydays. This then was the Mediterranean world, created gradually by settlers from the 800s BC and earlier, and brought to its climax in the east by the spectacular conquests of Alexander the Great and his successors in the 300s BC. And politically and culturally united as a whole by the Roman Empire. Once the layout and structure of this world is understood, the events of the 500s and 600s begin to make sense. And the ending of that world, the world of classical antiquity, can be accounted for. From this perspective, we can see that the very remoteness of the new Romano-Germanic kingdoms in the Occident appeared, from Constantinople, to be nothing too serious to become alarmed about. If the emperors at the great palace at Constantinople had been told that the Roman Empire had fallen and that the Dark Ages had begun, they would have thought the messenger to be a madman. And that is what we have been taught for the past 300 to 400 years. In the far-off Occident, the newly formed power elites operated independently from the Western Roman imperial political system. However, they continued to acknowledge the prestige of the emperor in Constantinople, and to some extent considered that they ruled their old Roman diocese under his aegis. We have seen how King Clovis of the Franks was formally invested with the insignia of a Roman consul by the legates of the Emperor Anastasius, who had come for that purpose from Constantinople to Tours in northern France in 507. After the migrations had in this way settled down, towards the end of the century, a relative stability gradually established itself over the Occident. The fulcrum of this balance was Theodoricus, a fully Romanized Austro-Gothic overlord, installed with his court in the imperial palace at Ravenna. Under his rule, all of Italy and Illyria, Western Balkans, formed a single dominion, which extended to Provence and to Burgundy. Theodoricus' influence also extended to the Alpine lands, then known as Raetia. Only in the north of Gaul did the Franks escape his reach. There Regulus, lesser king Clodovecus, in defeating the Goths in 507, had completely altered the relative power relationships in the west. Nevertheless, Theodoricus saved the defeated Goths as they retreated south to Hispania and made them his clients. It was his ministers at Ravenna who chose which of the leading Gothic lords should be governor of the diocese representing at two removes the imperial authority, while Roman bishops continued to rule the cities and the population of Gothic Spain. Theodoricus was formally subordinate to, but effectively autonomous from, the emperor in Constantinople. He was patricius of Italy and the West. He always maintained the correct protocol vis-à-vis the imperial court at Constantinople that his position required. Towards his death in 526, however, relations deteriorated as the Orthodox religious uniformity now triumphant at Constantinople found his Arianism increasingly insupportable. Over the previous century, a fundamental religious shift had occurred within Mediterranean culture. Christianity was now the dominant belief system and had become the state religion of the empire. Political loyalty, as well as right and decent social behavior, was measured by one's Christian orthodoxy. Over the previous 2 centuries, there had been a vehement dispute within Christian circles over the nature of Christ within the Trinity. To what extent had the Holy Man of Galilee been divine, and to what extent human? And how could his divinity and or humanity be expressed in words? Following the doctrine of the deacon Arius of Alexandria, who had died in 336, one faction laid stress on Christ's humanity and on God's exclusive divinity. The other, the majority of Orthodox Catholic bishops, asserted the sameness in nature and substance, and yet separateness in identity of all 3 persons of the Trinity. As early as 325, Constantine himself had convened the Council of Nicaea to deal with this heated dispute. Over a century later, episcopal thunder was still being thrown at the doctrine of Christ's humanity at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and the argument continued unabated into the 500s. In these centuries, this was a crucial political as well as theological argument. The whole period cannot be made sense of unless this is understood. For if a society was to live at peace, united under a presiding government, then it should above all be united about the most fundamental of issues. To the mentalities of the time, a rival theological doctrine all too readily served as a rallying cry for popular riots and for the contestation of political authority by factions among the mighty. By the early 500s, Orthodox conviction against Arianism and heresy generally was rising to an uncompromising pitch, from one end of the Christian Mediterranean to the other. The advent to the imperial throne at Constantinople in 527 of a vigorous young man, Flavius Petrus Sabatius Justinianus, known to us as Justinian, was to bring a theological political war on a huge scale to the Western Empire. It would end by destroying Italy as the political center of the West, a position it had always held and which it has never recovered. Here we have the tone of the period from the opening paragraph of his great codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis of 534. Book 1, Title 1, concerning the high trinity of the Catholic faith, and that no one shall dare publicly to dispute it. We desire that all the peoples who are governed by the moderate rule of our clemency shall practice that religion which was carried by the divine Peter to the Roman people. We order all who accept this law to assume the name of Catholic Christians, and decree that all others, mad and foolish persons, shall bear the infamy of their heretical dogmas, to be punished first by divine vengeance, and secondly by the exertion of our power, which we have received by divine favor." End quote. With such a strong reaffirmation and setting in stone of this uncompromising attitude, restating an edict of Emperor Theodosius 150 years previously, Justinianus was giving notice that to the Roman state, Arianism was an antisocial abomination and would be crushed by the full power of the law. But not only were there covert Arians among the bishops and clergy of the Eastern Empire, but all of the fast Romanizing Germanic kings and their nobilities of the West were open Arians, except, of course, for the Franks. Most offensive of all was the Arian Patricius of Italy, ruling from Ravenna in the name of the Orthodox Emperor. The whole Occident appeared to be in the grip of Germanic warriors committed to the Arian heresy and oppressing the Romano-Catholic people of the cities, who looked to Constantinople for protection and prayed for the rectification of the situation. Justinian had an entire political program in mind, which was nothing less than the restoration of the Roman Empire to the position it had held during its glory days, the Renovatio Imperii. But this empire was now understood as the entire Christian people, united under the instruction of their Orthodox Catholic bishops and governed by their God-ordained emperor and by no other. The emperor's authority was in mimesis Theou, on earth, an imitation of God's great authority in heaven. Justinian's vision can be seen today, stated in stone, in Constantinople, or Istanbul, in the great church of the Holy Wisdom, the Hagia Sophia. Today it stands with minarets added to the corners. No structure in our civilization, or in most others, was to surpass it in scale or splendor for the next 1,000 years. Justinian ruled at Constantinople in the grand style of the imperial tradition, passionately supporting his faction in the chariot-racing hippodrome, the blues against the greens. A riot in the hippodrome in 532 nearly lost him the throne and his life, and, by unleashing the army into the mob, cost the lives of thousands of citizens. However, he soon recovered his political poise. The following year, 533, he sent his general Belisarius with a fleet to oust the Vandals from Carthage and reintegrate that Roman province once more into the empire. After 2 pitched battles, Belisarius was completely victorious. Carthage, and with it Roman Africa, was to remain under the direct authority of Constantinople for the following century. A feud at Ravenna over the succession to the Gothic kingship in Italy provided the excuse for the Romans to invest Sicily in 535. Belisarius landed his forces in Italy the following year. Rome soon fell to the imperial forces, and by 540 all of Italy as far as Milan was back within the fold of the empire. In their desperation, the Goths had given Provence and parts of Burgundy to the Franks, in return for military help which never materialized. However, in 542, the elective monarchy of the Goths produced a dynamic new leader named Totila, who led a spirited counterattack. Calamity struck the Romans as the Sassanid Parthians again launched a war on the empire in present-day Georgia, forcing the withdrawal of some forces from Italy and, crucially for the future, from the Danube frontier. To add to it all, the bubonic plague erupted in Egypt and soon spread to the whole Mediterranean, eventually killing off perhaps a quarter of the population. One setback followed another, and the war dragged on for another 15 years, finally ending in 555. Justinian issued a pragmatic sanction or decree, bringing Italy directly under the rule of Constantinople. In 554, Justinian's troops were invited from Gaul into Hispania as an ally of the Goth Athenagildus. They retook Baetica and Carthaginoensis, the south and the southeast, as well as the Balearic Islands, forming the Provincia Spaniae, to the great rejoicing of the still determinedly Roman populace there. With part of Hispania ruled by his general Liberius, the Roman dromoi, a type of war galley, controlled the western Mediterranean. It looked as if Justinian's hugely ambitious program had largely been achieved. The most Romanized regions of the west, except southern Gaul, were back under direct imperial rule. But the triumph was in many respects an illusion. The reconquest had thoroughly devastated Italy, the heart and soul of the Occident. The war and the anarchy that accompanied it had broken the wealth and power of the Italian senatorial aristocracy. The city of Rome was, at a certain point in the war, for the first time emptied of its inhabitants. Bands of freebooting soldiers, passing armies, and imperial tax exactions came on top of the plague. The imperial general Narses invited from Central Europe into Italy the great tribal confederation of the Longobardi. By the time the struggle had ended, the empire was exhausted, and it was bankrupt. The Sassanids, of Iran or Persia, were becoming ever more belligerent. When the great emperor died in 565, he left Italy ruined and the empire drained of resources in a perilous situation. Into the spaces left soft or vacant flowed other forces. The Franks, as Gothic Italy went into terminal crisis, extended their dominion, absorbing Provence in 536 and subordinating the Burgundian elite. By 548 they had brought the Alemanni and the Thuringians across the Rhine under their tutelage. As hundreds of thousands of Longobardi vacated Central Europe for Italy, the duchy forming north of the Alps, Bavaria, was also integrated into the Frankish system. The collapse of Italy also reinvigorated the Goths of Hispania. Seeing the return of imperial power to the peninsula and having seen the fate that befell their Gothic cousins in Italy, they threw off any sense of identification with imperial legitimacy and went over onto the offensive. In 568, a new Gothic king, Liuvigildus, undertook an ambitious program of subduing the entire peninsula and setting up a wholly independent kingdom. In this process, medieval Spain was born. Liuvigildus conquered Cordoba in 573 and drove the Romano-Germanic Suevi out of the city of Leon, an important strategic strongpoint because of its formidable Roman fortifications. Liuvigildus struck his own coins without stamping the head of the emperor in Constantinople on them, the first time that a Gothic king had done so. But there were serious limitations to his power. As the new Germanic élite were elsewhere, the Goths in Hispania were a military caste. They were the army, the exercitus, and as warrior aristocrats they held large estates from which they lived. But they were few in number, perhaps only 1 or 2% of the population. In order to rule, they had to rely on the sullen cooperation of the Orthodox Catholic bishops, who led the populations of the Roman cities. The Goths themselves were Arians. To address this mismatch between the rulers and the ruled, Liuvigildus launched a 9-year persecution of the Romano-Catholics, ousting their bishops and giving their churches to the Arian clergy. The persecution caused deep political divisions and resentment, undermining the hegemony of the warriors. Taking advantage of this, the king of the Suevi in Galicia converted to Catholicism, making matters more difficult still for the Arian Gothic king. These tensions were resolved when Euvagildus died in 587. His son Recaredus converted to Catholicism without hesitation. There were several revolts in favour of Arianism among a section of the Gothic aristocracy, but they were swiftly put down. Adopting the role of Constantine vis-à-vis the Church, Recaredus convened a council of all the Catholic bishops, Tosius Spaniae vel Galliae, of all Spain and Gaul, at Toledo in 589. This council affirmed the orthodox doctrines of the Trinity and of consubstantiation. The king then promulgated an edict embodying these doctrines as laws, applying to everyone in the realm. We can see in this perhaps the beginning of Catholic Spain. In response, the Emperor Maurice had the walls of the chief Roman fortress in Iberia, Cartagena, strengthened. In 610, a church council decided that since the capital of the province of Carthaginensis was in the hands of the enemy, that is, the Roman Empire, that the metropolitan seat of the bishop should be moved to Toledo. This stance reveals the totality of the shift in allegiance and of identity by the Hispano-Romans following the Gothic conversion of 589. Kings Sigebut and Swintila attacked and expelled the Romans from the last city strongholds of Baetica, completed in 624. Again, this was made possible by the Heraclian Great War far away in the east. Italy, ostensibly under imperial rule from Ravenna, was still reeling from the effects of 20 years of war, death, and ruin. But it was not given any peace. The Longobardi, the long-bearded ones, entered the peninsula in 568 by the usual route through the Julian Alps in present-day Slovenia, moving down to the Veneto region of northeast Italy. These were a mixed set of barbarians from the interior of Germania, lacking the long contact with Roman culture of many of their predecessors. They took Mediolanum, Milan, in 569 and Pavia in 572, where they set up their capital, forming the region that is still known today as Lombardia or Lombardy. Their project to conquer all of Italy from the Romans was to endure for the next 2 centuries. More calamities befell the Imperium Romanum. Starting in 586, new and previously unheard of peoples descended from the north and east of the Eurasian landmass. The savage Avar horsemen, who settled in the perennial base for steppe nomads, preying upon Europe, the grasslands of the Pannonian Plain, present-day Hungary. Behind them came the Slavi or Slavic peoples. These came as scattered tribes and not as a single large force. They crossed the Danube frontier, bereft of its garrisons, and spread gradually down the Balkans, avoiding the coastal cities and staying in the interior. By 610 they had established themselves as far south as mainland Greece itself. The trunk road between Constantinople and Dyrrhachium, and on by sea to Italy, the Via Ignatia, was from then on insecure. These tribes would one day, far in the future, form the community of the South Slavs, eventually giving rise to Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, etc. If we stop to consider for a moment what had been happening, we can see that for over 2 centuries, from the late 300s to the early 600s AD, the Roman Empire had been unable to hold back successive waves of armed mass immigration by tribal peoples from the north and the east. Once one group had entered and settled, taking over the running of the Roman diocese, another and less civilized group would come in behind them. Some of these groups originated deep in the Asian steppe and were not settlers but mere predators, like the Huns and the Avars. The question was, what, if anything, could stop this seemingly endless process of destruction and civilizational setback? The Roman Empire was to continue at Constantinople for a further 800 years, going through some periods of marked military renewal. But the overall trend remained heavily in favor of the invaders. What was needed in the West particularly was for the early immigrants and the indigenous Roman population to find common cause and develop a society that was internally solid enough and possessed of sufficient political purpose and military force to be able to thrust back the great waves of greed and destruction. Beneath the storm of the great events recounted here, that is precisely what was happening in Gaul and in Hispania, and then later in Lombardic Italy. It was a process of cultural fusion that was to create Europe. The fusion of the two populations, of the Roman indigenes and of the Germanic incomers, occurred on all levels, but primarily and explicitly through the vector of religion. At this phase of our culture, when the Christian religion had come to be the form and content of the civilization itself, its values, rituals, symbolism, its ideology, its morality, and its politics, that this should be so is what one would expect. The marker of assimilation was whether the settled Germanic warrior caste remained pagan, or more usually Arian Christian, or whether it embraced the orthodoxy of the Catholic form of Christianity, insisted on by the emperors at Constantinople, by the Orthodox bishops ruling the cities of the Old Empire, and by the indigenous Roman population. We should understand that in these centuries, Catholicity and Orthodoxy were identical terms describing the same dogmatic and ecclesiastical phenomenon. There were no separate Latin and Greek churches. Let us consider how this religious assimilation worked in practice. In the one-time Roman diocese of Gallia, now the Regnum Francorum, the kingdom of the Franks, the heirs of Clodovecus or Clovis, the dynasty known as the Merovingian, held court for their own Frankish nobility as well as for Roman bishops and the senatorial aristocracy. The Roman magnates supervised the continued functioning of the remaining parts of the Roman administration and gave the Frankish kings access to literacy, legal expertise, and chancery services. Here is a glimpse of the relationship between the Roman aristocracy and the Frankish warrior elite from Fredegar's chronicle, 200 years after the collapse of central imperial authority in the West. In 606, a Roman named Protadius was appointed majordomi, mayor of the royal household, by King Theodoricus of Burgundy, who was feuding with his Frankish brother Theodobertus. He was noted for his cruel stringency in squeezing as much revenue out of the lands of the fiscus as they could yield, and also for antagonizing the Burgundian war leaders. He advised the king to go against the wishes of the Burgundians and attack his brother. They resolved to kill him and surrounded the tent in which he was playing at dice with another Roman, the royal physician Petrus. Here we see two men of education serving the Romano-Germanic king, and the mayor getting above his station in the eyes of the warrior elite. These detained the king and his leudes, his band of armed followers, while they tore through the tent with their swords and slew the mayor. The following year, King Theodoricus appointed another Roman named Claudius to the office of majordomus, whom the chronicler tells us in Latin was genere Romanus, of Roman kind, or one of the Romans. He was intelligent, a good adviser, litterum eruditus, well versed in literature, the classical paideia, and a friend to one and all. He behaved quietly and kept his temper because of what had happened to his predecessor. His only failing was that he was very fat due to over-feasting. Roman bishops were accorded a higher status than the senators among the Franks, Burgundians, and Goths. The bishops, effective rulers of the Roman cities, became the representatives of the interest of the Romans to the king. Letters survive addressed to Frankish kings from even before the collapse of imperial power, confidently exhorting them to listen to the wise advice of the Roman bishop. One Merovingian king, Chilpericus I, grumbled that, quote, "There is no one with any power left but the bishops." End quote. The cities of Gaul remained important. Paris, in the far north from a Roman perspective, may have had a population of 15,000. Its arena held 8,000. The civic administration was in the care of the city's bishop, and no longer a matter for an elected civic elite, as in the days of classical antiquity. The bishop used the income from the surrounding episcopal estates to care for the poor, maintain the walls and the aqueduct. The bishop would be expected to go out and meet barbarian armies before the walls, as Pope Leo had courageously faced the Huns as they approached Rome in 452. And the bishops could provide other useful services. In the 430s, Bishop Marcellus of Paris confronted the dragon that inhabited the heath along the Seine, and it forced it to lower its head and wag its tail, and then to disappear forever, to the great rejoicing of the people. This, according to the poet Venantius Fortunatus, writing in the mid-500s. Bishops were the leaders of the Roman population, and particularly of the upper levels of society. They were members of the high senatorial nobility, the foremost representatives of the leading families of the province. They were elected to office by, quote, the clergy and the people, end quote, as the formula had it, which in practice meant the archdeacon and the local senatorial families. At this time, the idea of a Gallic or Hispanic bishop being appointed by the Pope was inconceivable. The bishoprics disposed of very major funds from the vast estates with which they had been endowed. Since the landed nobility had donated these very estates, they expected them to remain in the family and not to pass to a rival one. The sons and nephews of bishops succeeded to the seats of their fathers and uncles. Competition among the great families was fierce to gain election of their own candidate, and violence and even murder were not unknown methods of achieving the prize. Almost all bishops were high aristocrats and were expected to be steeped in the classical literary tradition, though they need not have a theological or religious background or even be priests. As laymen, they could be consecrated to the cathedra or episcopal throne. Most of them already had a secular career behind them and would have been married, but at this stage of their lives would have separate quarters from their wives in the bishop's palace and take a vow of celibacy in the ancient Christian tradition of carnal abstinence. In his public administration, the bishop would be accompanied and assisted and advised by his wife, the episcopa. Each city and its surrounding territories was under the jurisdiction of a bishop. As royal power became more established, the city also had a comes, or count, representing the king and forming the temporal beside the spiritual arm of administration. This dualism between the bishop and the count was to characterize the entire medieval period to the very highest level of the political structure. The precedence of the bishop in political life can be seen in the titles and ranking of the chess pieces which we have inherited from the Middle Ages. The bishops stand beside the king and queen and come before the knights and castellans. In 550, a man called Felix became Bishop of Nantes, and when not engaged in ecclesiastical affairs, lived the life of a Roman senator at his favorite villa at Charcey on an estate of 3,000 hectares along the banks of the Loire. If this was barbarism, then it was a barbarism that had many features of the style of life that had been led over the centuries of Roman rule. A whole society does not simply vanish when military and political power passes to a semi-Romanized hegemonic minority. The shadow of the old Roman provinces shaped the Frankish dominions. In the more Roman south, the provinces of Aquitaine and Provence remained almost untouched by Germanic influence. The senatorial aristocracy there retained its positions of power and preeminence. In Burgundy and Bavaria, there was a blending of the new ruling class with the old, forming communities of interest and of identity through networks of intermarriage. In the north, in the home provinces of the Franks, there crystallized a political society and identity which was called Austrasia, or Eastern Land. The area of the one-time Roman kingdom of Syagrius, conquered by Clodovicus, consolidated as the kingdom of Neustria, or the New Lands. In keeping with Frankish custom, on the death of King Clodocarius I in 561, the realm was divided between his 4 sons. For one reason and another, the reimposition of the Roman taxation on the nobles of Austrasia, the strangling in her bed of the wife of the king of Neustria among them, aristocratic revolt, fed royal vendetta and civil war for the following 4 decades. Only in 613 did a king emerge who could suppress the disorder, Clotharius II. As part of the settlement of the civil wars at the turn of the 600s, Clotharius issued an edict at Paris guaranteeing that the traditional rights of the church, the nobility, and the people would be respected by the crown. Accordingly, we ordain by this general authority that in all trials the ancient norms of sworn evidence should be applied, and that no judgment by whatever judge should hold force which goes beyond the rule of law and equity. This edict was 600 years before Magna Carta 1214, of which so much is made today. Magna Carta was by no means either the first nor the only charter protecting rights and immunities from royal power. Indeed, the persistence of documents of this type over long stretches of time is evidence of the innate pressure for liberty present in European political culture from its very origins. Political liberty was rooted in the very real power of the members of the political community, that is, the warrior class. It was not a matter of abstract natural rights, as it has become with us. It was the concrete freedom and autonomy of the warrior caste vis-à-vis their king, rights and immunities that they began to insist be written down in formal legal documents in accordance with the Roman legal and documentary tradition. To understand the past, we should appreciate that in classical antiquity there was no concept of universal rights. There were the free and there were the unfree. The ancient world, like most human societies, was characterized by mass slavery. Perhaps a third of the population fell into this category. Slavery was normal. There were intermediary levels of freedom, such as the large population of freed slaves. There was a specific place in the Forum of Trajan at Rome set aside for the ritual whereby masters manumitted or freed their slaves. As we have seen, after about 300 AD, there was a tendency for the gap between the powerful and these intermediary classes of free individuals to widen drastically, resulting in a leveling of the latter down to being in personal dependence on their lord or dominus. The politically active and enfranchised part of the society was a minority. It consisted of those who were entitled to appear at the curia regis, the king's court. These were the landowning and arms-bearing nobility, both Roman and Germanic. Indeed, our term for the political franchise originally meant that someone had the rights of a Frank, as in the Germanic tribal name. Such men were, as warriors, free and honest. Their word could be trusted. Thus we have the sense of the word to be frank. Alongside the secular and warrior nobility stood the clergy. As we have seen, literacy gave one access to at least the lower ranks of the clergy, and thereby to a degree of judicial enfranchisement, to enfrankment. Interestingly, there is documentary, if uninformative, evidence at this time of peasant assemblies, the conventus vicinorum, a spontaneous form of free political association which would feature prominently in the rural life of the Middle Ages. The understanding of society as being composed of groups of differing qualities, as they said, is repugnant to our modern democratic sensibility. But this older view persisted from antiquity for well over a millennium and lasted deep into the 19th century. When the time comes, we will see how and why our culture changed in this fundamental matter. But here is Pope Gregory the Great writing in August 595 from Rome to the bishops of Gaul. Quote, Providence has established various degrees and distinct orders, so that, if the lesser show deference to the more powerful, and if the greater bestow love, dilectio, on the lesser, then true concord and a weaving together will arise out of diversity. Indeed, the community could not subsist at all if the total order of difference did not preserve it. That creation cannot be governed in equality is taught us by the example of the heavenly hosts. There are angels and archangels, which are clearly not equals, differing the one from the other in power and order. End quote. Those who were part of the political system held real power. Nobles on their home estates ruled the lives of thousands of souls. From among their own relatives and their clients, they could constitute bodies of well-armed and mounted warriors. The Romano-Germanic kings had no standing armies. They too raised forces from among their clientele and dependents. By virtue of their kingship, their clientele was the nobility, who came to their aid when summoned, if it was in their interest and it was their obligation. The king had superior resources because he had come into possession of the imperial fiscus, the great estates on prime lands in every diocese that once united the empire. The perennial problem for a king was to gratify the honor of his clients, who had served him, by rewarding them with gifts of new dominions. In times of successfully waged war, this was easy. In times of peace, it meant that gifts had to be made by alienating parcels of the imperial fiscus, the royal domains. Because of this fundamental political reality, no medieval king of Christendom was, nor could be, a despot or an autocrat. This is shown in the political and religious development of Gothic Hispania, or Spain, as it was to be somewhat later by Frankish Gaul. The church councils convened by the Gothic kings of Spain after the conversion of Recaredus to orthodoxy in 587 immediately took on a constitutional and political significance. They were no longer synods of the church to regulate its internal affairs, as they remained in Gaul for many more decades. They were sovereign political assemblies, where the king's agenda, the Tomus Regalis, was debated by the assembly of the bishops, each the ruler and protector of his city and thus its representative. With the warrior magnates present, but it is unclear whether they had the formal right to participate. The Western tradition of the institutional separation of potestas, executive power, from legitimizing auctoritas, authority, takes on its clear form here. The Gothic kings worked this constitution almost as pupils of the most senior bishops. The Fourth Council of Toledo in 633, presided over by the great Isidore of Seville, bestowed legitimation on Sassanids, who had seized the throne 2 years previously, and instituted the practice of administering a sacred unction, or oil, to bestow the sacral nimbus on the king. This was later copied in Carolingian Francia and remained a potent sacral political ritual right up until the 29th of May, 1824, when the sacre, or ritual coronation, of Charles X occurred, the last king of France. In doing so, Isidore also placed a radical conditionality on the holding of the royal office, which was unknown in the political culture of Constantinople. The verbal formula for the royal right intoned by the bishop to the new king was brutally explicit. Rex eris si recte facias, si non facias non eris. You are king if you act by right, if not, you are not. The wish of the emperors at Rome had been both the law and its legitimation. Here we have a different notion, that of the legitimacy of the king's rule so long as he rules justly, in accordance with the laws, and does not violate anyone's rights, freedoms, or immunities. Turning now to Italy, The Roman Emperor at Constantinople continued to rule what remained of the imperial territory there after the arrival of the Lombards. Soon there were Lombard duchies in south-central Italy at Spoleto in 570 and Benevento. The empire held the bottom half or boot of Italy and the dog's leg formation between Ravenna and Rome along the Via Flaminia, the so-called Exarchate of Ravenna, a configuration that was to remain a sovereign entity until 1860. The emperor at Constantinople held these territories along with Sicily and Roman Africa. However, often he was unable to pay his western garrisons, and it was left partially to the Pope to pay the wages of the imperial troops in Italy to defend Rome against the tightening encirclement of the Lombards. The bishops of Rome, claiming precedence and authority among the 5 Christian patriarchates, Alexandria, Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome, in matters of dogma and discipline, still depended on the emperor and sent their legate to Constantinople throughout the 600s and into the next century to receive the imperial assent to their nomination to office. The popes, especially from Leo the Great onwards in the 450s, resolutely defended their primacy vis-a-vis the patriarchs of Constantinople, but they still remained subordinate to the authority of the emperor in that city. In 638, Emperor Heraclius refused to confirm the elected Pope Severinus in office and sent his officers to ransack the Lateran Palace in Rome to express his displeasure. In 653, Pope Martinus was arrested on the orders of Emperor Constans II and brought to Constantinople and later exiled. The emperors could still generously endow the Roman Church. As outright owners of all the temples and property confiscated, a literal use of the term, from the pagan religion in the previous centuries, the Emperor Phocas gave the temple of all the gods, the Pantheon in Rome, over to the care of Pope Benedict IV, who consecrated it as the Sancta Maria ad Martyres, Our Lady of the Martyrs, thereby preserving this magnificent ancient temple intact for us to visit today. Although it was not the tradition of the ancient Roman Church for the Bishop of Rome to hold ecclesiastical authority over the bishops of other cities in the West, nevertheless the reflex of the great Italian senatorial class was to adopt a wider perspective and to see as their concern that the whole ecumene of all society be brought to salvation. Legend has it that in 573, while the future Pope Gregory was walking through the Forum at Rome, he noticed some barbarian youths being offered for sale as slaves. Noticing perhaps their blonde hair, he inquired where they came from. They were pagan Angles from Britannia, he was informed. He quipped, "Non Angli sed Angeli se forent Christiani." That would be angels, not Angles, if they were but Christians. He did not forget the savage pagans living beyond the sea. In 595, he commissioned the prior of a Benedictine monastery in Rome, Augustinus, to lead a mission to the court of the King of Kent, Ethelbert, who was married to a Catholic Frankish princess. This was a common feature of the conversions of pagan tribes for centuries. We remember that in the 490s, the Frankish chieftain Clodovicus was induced to be baptized by his Christian wife. In July 598, Pope Gregory the Great was able to write to the Patriarch of Alexandria, quote, "We have heard that last Christmas more than 10,000 Angles were baptized." End quote. Augustinus had set up the Archbishopric of Canterbury, from which the conversion of pagan Britannia radiated. This success was to be a sign for the future. The papacy in Rome would, in a sense, outflank the long-established and autonomous bishops of Gaul and Spain by spurring missionary expeditions beyond Christendom into neighbouring barbarian lands. At this time, however, the emperors at Constantinople faced formidable problems in their eastern provinces. Emperor Phocas had been a brutal soldier who had seized the throne. Heraclius toppled him in turn. The Shah of the Sassanids, Chosroes II, sensed the weakness of the Romans, and in 613 sent a large army to invade Syria under his general Sharbaraz. The Roman army which met them was defeated. The Persians besieged and took the great city of Antiochia and slew the patriarch and deported most of its citizens to Persia as slaves. The Persian advance through Syria and Palestine foreshadowed in many ways the dynamics of the Islamic conquests that were to come. The slaughter and enslavement of resisting city populations was routine, as was the killing or enslavement of their religious leaders. The landowning magnates of Roman Syria and Palestine had been funding the building of fortifications against the Persians since Emperor Phocas' reign, but resistance was weak due to the ferocity of the onslaught. A Roman field army was again defeated at Daraa, south of Damascus, by Sharbaraz. News of this defeat reached down the Arabian Peninsula and made an impression upon the Arabs. The defeat appears in the Quran as the Surat al-Rum. Muhammad, at that early point in his life, apparently supported the Romans rather than the Persians. In 614, Caesarea Maritima and Tiberias in Palestine fell to the Persians. Sharbaraz laid siege to Jerusalem for 3 weeks, storming it on the 20th of May. Roman Christian Jerusalem then had 66,600 inhabitants, of whom 57,000 are said to have been slaughtered, many of these being people who tried to hide in caves and other places, and about 35,000 were taken captive as slaves or for ransom. Patriarch Zacharias was led away with them, along with the true cross, the ultimate relic of Christianity and of the Roman people. All were led out of the eastern gate of Jerusalem, the Porta Probaticae, for the long journey east. The chronicler Strategios wrote, quote, "In that time, my beloved brothers, great sadness and unspeakable grief befell all the Christians in the world, because the chosen and renowned city was delivered to devastation, because the holy places and the refuge of all the faithful was delivered to fire, and the Christian people were delivered to death and captivity." End quote. The news shook Constantinople and undermined the legitimacy of the emperor. Repeated accusations were made against the Jews of Jerusalem for having betrayed the city to the Persians, and even of participating in the massacre that followed its fall. The Persians soon took Egypt itself and advanced unresisted through Anatolia. It looked as if the whole Roman Empire in the east had been lost in 2 or 3 years. Heraclius begged for peace terms and received a thundering reply from Chosroes. "I shall not spare you until you have renounced the crucified one, whom you call God, and bow down before the sun." The Persians were, and always had been, sun and fire worshippers of the god Ahura Mazda. It took years to build up the resources to fight back, but Heraclius personally led a reformed Roman field army out of Constantinople on Easter Monday in 622, on a campaign that the whole city knew to be a life and death struggle. A sense of collective religious fervor permeated the great effort being mounted, focused on and symbolized by the holy icons borne before the emperor. This was a war explicitly to win back the true cross, literally a crusade, avant la lettre. Heraclius led his army across Asia Minor and deep into the northern lands of the Persian Empire, campaigning relentlessly for 6 long years. In 625, Heraclius burned the Ganja, the most sacred temple of the Persians, to the ground. Meanwhile, the thrust of the Persian campaign was directed against Constantinople. They besieged the mother of cities, aided by the Avars and the Gepids from Hungary and the Bulgars from the Balkans. The Patriarch had an image of the Blessed Virgin and Child displayed on the great walls of Theodosius, facing the Avar horde. The walls proved impregnable, and the city, not for the last time, was saved by the huge investment in military engineering that had been made 300 years previously. Finally, in December 627, the Persian forces were annihilated at Nineveh in modern Iraq. As the Romans descended on their capital, Ctesiphon, on the Tigris, the Sassanid inner circle deposed Chosroes and sued for peace. The Roman Empire regained all of its provinces in the eastern Mediterranean, and all the Christian slaves, taken since the initial invasion 14 years previously, were set free. On his return to Constantinople, Heraclius held a jubilant triumph, his voice echoing in the Church of the Holy Wisdom. Quote, "Let all the earth raise a great cry to God, serve the Lord in gladness, enter into his presence in exultation, and recognize that God is Lord indeed. It is he who has made us, and not we ourselves. We are his people and sheep. Let all we Christians, praising and glorifying, give thanks to the one God, rejoicing with great joy in his holy name. For fallen is the great Chosroes, opponent of God. He is fallen and cast down to the depths of the earth, and his memory is utterly exterminated from earth. He who was exalted and spoke injustice in arrogance and contempt against the Lord Jesus Christ, the true God, and his undefiled mother, our Blessed Lady, Mother of God and ever Virgin Mary. For perished is the profaner with a resounding noise." End quote. He then journeyed back to Jerusalem in order to restore the true cross. He had all Jews within 3 miles of the city expelled. Entering as a pilgrim barefoot, he gave thanks for his victory at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The perennial and long-believed insurmountable enemy of the West, Persia or Parthia, feared since the days of Augustus 6 centuries previously, had been annihilated. The Persian power was in a state of collapse. Its sanctuaries and palaces were in ruins, its morale broken. It must have been an intoxicating moment for the Romaioi, the Romans of the East. But the Roman state was almost as exhausted as its defeated enemy. Both sides had thrown their all into the great, long struggle. By a fortuitous historical coincidence, an obscure tribal religious war among the desert nomads of the Arabian Peninsula had just been resolved. A new religious movement led by Muhammad had won out over all its rivals and, for the first time, had united the desert tribes into a single and expansionary force. It is recorded in Arabic sources that in 629, just 2 years after his great triumph, Heraclius was sent a letter by Muhammad, which can also be sent to, quote, the kings of the earth, inviting him to submit to the new religion, namely Islam. With that great simplicity and clarity so characteristic of this creed, the word itself means the submission, nothing more nor less. The Roman emperor's reaction to this ultimatum, emanating from the deserts beyond the frontiers, is unknown. In that same year, 629, the first armed incursions were made out of Arabia into Roman Syria and Palestine. The world was about to change in a way unimagined by contemporaries. The beginning and the end of our period were marked by 2 immense struggles waged by the Roman emperors, by Justinian's offensive to re-establish direct imperial authority in the Occident, and by Heraclius's defensive fight to the death against the Parthians. But both struggles greatly weakened the Roman Empire and opened the way to secessions in the West and to an era of unremitting onslaughts upon its heartland provinces in the East. In the interim, the new kingdoms of Western Europe were beginning to take on their characteristic features and to consolidate into functioning societies on a new path. It was well that they did, for a storm was arising from the southern deserts that would threaten the very existence of Helleno-Roman society for centuries to come.